Welcome to an unnecessarily cold weekend. In this weekend, Blizzard has announced they were going to go through some balance tuning and spec and class changes for the next reset. So on January 12 or 13, if you're in EU, these changes are gonna go live. So Blizzard has opted to go the route of buffing the underperforming specs rather than nerfing the overperforming ones. So a big breath of relief for all the marksmanship hunters, balance druids, unholy DKs, affliction warlocks. They are safe for the moment, but don't worry, their time will come. So Blizzard instead has set their eyes on Assassination Rogue, Frost Mage, Fury Warrior, and also Blood DK, a tank. So let's go over the changes that Blizzard has announced and let's see how much they will actually impact the spec. Because we have to start with the weaker changes, the smaller changes, which is a rebalancing between the dual wield and the two-handed build that Frost DK, Windwalker, and Brewmaster can all use. Now, when it comes to Windwalker and Brewmaster, most of their toolkit, most of their abilities don't really change. Frost DK, on the other hand, is the spec that can legitimately change a lot if you're using a dual wield build or a two-handed build. So the sweeping change to all three specs is that their damage is increased by 2% while a two-handed weapon is equipped. Now, what is weird with this change is that for Windwalker and Brewmaster it's okay, because it's just a fix. Windwalker is doing fine in damage, as we have reported on this already a few times, and Brewmaster also is doing quite well in damage. Definitely a big change compared to the disaster that the damage done of a Brewmaster Monk was in BFA. The important change, or lack of change, is on Frost, because Frost is doing pretty badly. I thought it was interesting that the change to Frost was only in line with the Monk, the dual wield versus two-handed fix, because Frost DK was also on the low end when it came to performance. Admittedly, they weren't performing as lowly, as badly in terms of damage in raids like Fury, Assassination, and Frost, but they were still at the bottom. So that's interesting that they were left in this state. It makes, of course, even more of an effect when you compare that the only other spec playable for DK, for Death Knight as a DPS, is Unholy. And the difference is now very, very big. So I don't think this change is going to do anything to Frost, obviously, and neither it will to Windwalker and Brewmaster. Not that Windwalker and Brewmaster needed anything at the moment. So moving on to the actual big changes, the actual changes that could impact the specs. We're starting with the only tank that was changed, because Blood Death Knight has gotten a pretty good buff. Because when we look at Blood Death Knight, this buff is very good for the way the spec works. When you look at a buff, Death Knight could have gotten buffed a multitude of ways. They could have gotten more default stamina, they could have gotten some of their talents changed and buffed, they could have gotten some damage reduction increase on the rune tap, they could have gotten some buffs to Marrowrend, the amount of charges of Dawn Shield generated by Marrowrend, reduced rune costs, or reduced runic power costs. All these could be considered as buffs, right? The buff that they got, Bone Shield, is now going to scale with 70% of your stamina converted into armor instead of 50. So from 50 to 70, the number has increased by 40%, 20% total. The reason why this is good is because Blood Death Knight has two types of active mitigation. They have Marrowrend, which gives you Bone Shield stacks, and then you have Death Strike, which heals you based on the damage you take. The reason why this is very good, that works in synergy with the way Blood Death Knight works, is that having more armor on your Bone Shield at all times, always, as long as Bone Shield is up, is going to make you take less damage, which means you have less to heal with your Death Strike. And this is the entire way Death Knight works, because they want to stock up in runic power, they want to get ready to take a bunch of damage, and then they want to spam their Death Strike up to 3 times, they can actually even 4 now, to heal back up. Having a constant increased amount of armor thanks to this buff means they will actually need less healing every time they want to go for this cycle, which is pretty handy, it's pretty good. We will have to see just how much it is going to impact Death Knight as a whole. Of course, this is not going to do much of anything against magical damage, for example. It's also not going to increase the damage done, which is also a important part of a tank in Mythic Plus. So for this type of buff, we will have to see. Now though, for the actual big damage buffs, Assassination, Fury, and Frost Mage, we're going to start with what I considered should have required more attention, which is Assassination Rogue. So The buff says that Assassination has gotten its damage abilities buffed by 8%. Now, before you start getting overly excited, all the 24 Assassination Rogue players, you have to remember that your damage and your abilities damage are two different things. Because when you look at the damage output, the average damage output of a rogue in a single target fight, even a cleave fight actually, this is more or less how it looks like. Yeah, you see that annoyingly long bar at the top is melee auto attack. That's not going to do anything with your buff, because that's not an ability. It's not going to be affected. Not only that, but even things, don't forget, even things like your trinket or trinkets, things like your weapon enchant. In this expansion, you have a chest enchant doing damage as well, your damage potion. All this stuff doesn't actually count as your damage for this buff. It's just your abilities. So 25% of the Assassination Rogue's damage doesn't come from abilities. So this 8% is actually a 6% overall damage buff. Now, when we look at the current state of things in raids, Assassination is here. So it doesn't change, actually, if you look at all logs or if you look at 90 percentile logs. The difference in DPS stays the same. In fact, for a couple of the specs here, it gets even worse, for Frost Mage and Fury. So when you look at the damage, it's 4,180, the average. You add to this damage the 6% buff they would be getting, and this is more or less where Assassination would end up in. So, solid middle of the pack. You know, they pass all the dead specs that have been unused, but they are still, you know, lower, problematically, than Outlaw. As well as, you know, much lower down than Windwalker and Unholy, particularly, specifically, Unholy. But this puts them on the map, at the very least. This takes them out of the hole of specs that get, you know, denied entry from raids, denied access by default. Now, they would still be in niche category, in niche tier, but at the very least, it wouldn't be, you know, outrageous to see someone playing Assassination, particularly because Assassination can still have its uses. Pure single target with Vendetta can still be decent. With this buff, it's certainly going to get better, so doesn't look as bad. It certainly looks better than before. Another spec with an 8% buff is going to be Fury. Same argument for Fury about their damage done. When you look at the overall damage done by Fury, they also have quite a bit of damage that doesn't come from their abilities. They have their melee, auto attack, which is lower than an Assassination Rogue, but for the buff of Fury, also the 8% damage buff is not going to affect Dragon Roar or Bladestorm. So, once you take out their melee, their Dragon Roar or Bladestorm, and all of their trinkets, potion, and enchants, roughly 20% of their damage is not going to come from abilities, so it's not going to be affected by this buff. When we look at the current damage of a Fury Warrior in a raid, Fury Warrior is sitting at 4,160. So you take that, you add the damage increase, which is going to be 6.4%, and they end up more or less here, which is slightly lower than an Assassination Rogue. The reason why this buff is more important, though, it's pretty clear. There are no other warrior specs clearly out-damaging Fury now. Before, neither Arms or Fury were doing particularly well, but with this buff as a better performing spec than Arms, which means a spot in a raid is now much more of a reality for Fury. Because remember, Protection isn't doing that well either, and Warrior happens to be bringing to a raid Battle Shout and Rallying Cry. So when you don't have a Protection Warrior in your raid, you want a Warrior. Guilds right now had to make do with an Arms Warrior, the least of two evils, but now that Fury Warrior has been buffed, they should be able to outperform Arms much more easily, at the very least, to get a raid spot. Now, it's always to be considered the fact that Warriors can still be pretty powerful during execute phases, and Arms Warrior is a better execute spec than Fury, almost entirely because of the damage increase they get on their Condemned as Arms rather than Fury. So I'm not even sure if this buff is going to make easily Fury Warrior better than Arms, but it can certainly make it competitive more than it was before. I still stand by my point that I made in September. If you wanted to play Warrior, you should have waited a year, because Warriors scale, by the way. Now, the last of the specs is going to be Frost Mage. And now we are back to the problem of rogues. Frost Mage has to contend not just with all of the other specs, particularly the range specs, but they also have to contend with fire. right? It is way more important for you to be the better performing specs of your class rather than being the better performing specs compared to other classes specs. And the case of Frost is pretty dire, honestly. This is where Frost currently is, the absolute bottom by quite a bit compared to the rest. So when we get the 9% buff, it's also good news for Frost, because being a spec that doesn't have a melee auto attack, it means much more of their damage is going to come from their abilities. In fact, 95% of a Frost Mage's damage is going to come purely from their abilities. So this 9% buff is almost entirely to the entirety of their damage. So you take the average damage of a Frost Mage, you give it a 9% buff, roughly 8.6% buff, and that's where they end up. Yeah, it is bad. It is so bad that I want to make Frost Mages a little bit better, feel a little bit better, so I'm going to show you how it would look in a pure single target fight, because this is just the overall damage of all bosses combined, is not too representative of each type of fight. So on single target, Frost Mage would be here, which looks much better, right? There is hope. It is still lower than Fire. Also, Fire has Gigantic Burst, which you don't have, which is also going to be a problem, but at the very least, now it's much better. So it seems like these buffs are going to bring all these 3 specs, when it comes to damage at least, in the middle. Before they were at the bottom, now they are somewhat in the middle. Problem number 1 is 2 out of these 3 specs still have a better performing spec in their own class. Outlaw and Fire, even technically Subtlety for Rogue. So it's going to be harder for them to become noticed, you know, to make way, elbowing people, trying to pass in front of them, compared to Warrior, where it's just Arms and Fury, and their very precious buffs they can bring to a raid with the death of Protection Warrior. It's going to be much easier for them to get a spot. Now we have to talk about something pretty important when it comes to these types of buffs though. Number 1, yes, these 3 specs are going to be taken from a ditch and brought in the middle. There is a problem now. There are going to be 3 other specs that were in the middle that are now closer to the bottom. So now we are going to have essentially Arms Warrior, which is going to get passed by all these 3 specs, is now close to the bottom. And now we have Beastmaster Hunter, which is now at the bottom, literally, and Destruction Warlock, which is now at the bottom. So that's another question mark, because amongst the specs that could have gotten a buff, these were certainly among them. So what's going to happen to them? But a more important point I want to point out. Remember that better performing specs are always going to have better players. Don't get me wrong, don't get mad if you are a hipster trying to play an unpopular spec. It is just a trickle-down effect. When there is a flavor of the month spec, competitive players are going to go to that spec because they want to push for high Mythic Plus keys, they want to push for Hall of Fame, top 50, top 10 in the world, so they want to play the absolute best. If Balanced Druid or Affliction Warlock or Unholy Decay are the best specs you can choose, all of the best players are going to go to play those specs. They're not going to play Destruction, they're not going to play Frost Decay, they're not going to play Feral Druid, they're going to be playing the better specs that can give them the best results, because that's what competitive players are going to want to do. So the current performances that you are seeing from Assassination, from Frost, from Frost Decay, even Fury Warrior or Demonology Warlock, Destruction Warlock, I'm not saying they are done by shitters, they're done by terrible players, but certainly the current performances are not done by the best players available, or the highest amount of best players available, because they are all playing better specs. So when a spec gets buffed like this, it is way more likely than better players, very good players, are going to give it a try. So their actual performance is going to increase more than what the buff is going to show, because there are going to be more good players willing to play that spec. And because more good players are willing to play the spec is going to be doing even better, which means more good players are going to want to play it, and then the spec is going to be doing even better. To give you a visual example, this is the difference between Fire and Frost right now, which is huge, right? But at the same time, this bar is showing you the median DPS that players are doing in those specs, the maximum and the minimum. So it is possible to do that much damage. And we see that the better Frost players are just in line with the worst of the average Fire Mage players. What happens if you shift the 40% best Fire players and you make them play Frost? You know, these lines of all these specs are pretty long. There is quite the impact that skilled players can bring to the actual performance of each spec. You know, take any of the specs in the bottom half, make them increase in performance by 20% because better players are playing them, and suddenly they're in the top half. So there can be quite a difference whenever a spec is buffed and whenever better players are going to flock to that spec, which is going to be more valuable than the buff itself in many cases. You can, of course, when you talk about these bars, make the point that FOTM, Flavor of the Month specs, are also going to attract not just the best players, but also the worst players, because they want to play the OP specs, meaning that their overall damage should be balanced by the best and the worst players. But it doesn't count, because when you look at 70, 80, even 90 percentile logs, the difference remains the same. So it's not really that is creating this difference. So this was the shred of hope I wanted to give to the specs currently at the bottom. They are at the bottom, yes, but they are also not piloted by the absolute best players, because the absolute best players are busy pushing content with the best available specs at the moment. That's going to happen every single time in every type of content. I know it gets you mad to hear, oh, the best players in the world are playing Havoc Demon Hunter. Yeah, man, it's a shit spec, it's got 2 buttons, it's brain dead easy, but that's what gets people to push content. So people are going to be playing that. And now they're playing Unholy. And now they are playing Balance, and they're playing Marksmanship. That's just what's going to happen when a spec is popular. So hope that enough good players are going to be going to your spec and give it a bump up compared to what it is now. I don't think none of this is actually going to change much when it comes to the specs that have gotten buffed. Warriors are still in their lethargic state of the start of an expansion. Assassination generally scales quite well deeper into an expansion, but I already pointed out in previous videos what the problem with Assassination was, which was also particularly way too much damage with auto attacks and poisons, too much waiting time and pooling, outdated essentially abilities and rotation. And for Frost Mage, Blizzard battered Frost Mage too much in the beta. After leaving it broken OP for 3 months, they just cut off their legs before the release, and now they are just slowly bringing it back up. I still think it's going to take a little bit more than this, but I am 100% sure it's going to go back on track by the next year. So for now, you're going to have to live with it as a mage. I don't think you're too worried though, as usual, for a pure DPS spec to have some rather popular specs always being meta. I would be way more scared if I were a Balanced Druid or a Shadow Priest right now, for example. So, closing this point, this was the last of the changes. It's gotten even too late. It's time to call it quits. See you guys tomorrow for who knows what. I don't know. I think it's going to be something to do with raids and dungeons, because it's middle of the week, it's weekend, and that's what we do usually, I think. So, see you guys soon. And in the meantime, a big F to all the specs that missed the buff train.